Ingrid Rowland, our distinguished guest speaker today, will help us to understand Sant'Andrea's architect, Gian Lorenzo Bernini, and his 17th century rival, Francesco Borromini, and the strengths of their approach to each small church. Ingrid Rowland has spent much of her academic career in Rome, where she is professor at the University of Notre Dame School of Architecture and a professor of history. Prior to that, she taught architecture and art history at the University of Chicago. She writes and lectures on classical antiquity, the Renaissance, the age of the Baroque for general audiences as well as special readers. She's a frequent contributor to the New York Review of Books, where I first became a fan of her work, and she's author of a number of books, including more recently, From Pompeii, The Afterlife of a Roman Town, which I just heard amazing things about today, not from Ingrid, but from another fan, named a Choice Outstanding Academic Book of the Year in 2015. The Collector of Lives, Giorgio Vasari and the Invention of Art, co-written with Noah Charney and published in 2017. And The Divine Spark of Syracuse, published in 2018. She was awarded the Society for Italian Historical Studies Howard R. Mararo Prize for her 2008 book, Giordano Bruno, Philosopher Heretic, which is a good title. Professor Rowland has also published translations of Vitruvius's 10 Books of Architecture and Giordano Bruno's Italian dialogue on the Heroic Frenzies. Her lecture today on a Roman rivalry, Gian Lorenzo Bernini and Francesco Borromini on the Strada Pia, is being recorded, so you can tell your friends if they had to miss it, that they have a chance to see that online in a few days at holycross.edu/McFarland Center. Please join me in welcoming Ingrid Rowland.
I guess we should have a vote when this is all over and see how it comes out. When I was a fellow at the American Academy in Rome, one of my fellows was an architect named Fred Travisano, and he walked into Sant'Andrea, and he was transfixed. And we ended up having a formal debate, and he went down to the forum, and he got a Venus de Milo and spray painted her gold and called her Golden Howard Rourke, and then we had these formal debates, which actually enter into this whole talk because I was for Borromini. I give away my case with all the 20-year-olds. And so we got ourselves all worked up. All the older people, including a literary scholar named Jim McGregor, thought they'd try to argue Bernini. Fred really believed Bernini was the greatest. Everybody else believed Borromini was the greatest, but they wanted to see if they could argue something they didn't really believe. And I threw an insult at the church, which Jim McGregor took up on the fly, realized he was a brilliant art historian, and started writing guidebooks, of which the first one was Rome from the Ground Up. If you haven't read that guidebook to Rome, it's fabulous, but it all started in a debate about these churches. It can be a life-changing experience. First, though, I thought I'd talk about the Strada Pia because a lot of you probably don't know what it is because it's not called that anymore. It's called Via 20 Settembre. And that's because in 20th of September, 1870, the papal Zouaves were defeated by the targeteers, the Bersaglieri of the Italian army, and Rome in 1870 finally joined the Italian state and became the capital of United Italy for the first time. And this was the road that the Bersaglieri went down chasing Zouaves. The Zouaves were a detachment that wore harem pants as their uniform. And as it turns out, one of the Zouaves was somebody who was also involved with the assassination to kidnap, not kill Abraham Lincoln, along with John Wilkes Booth. And so there's just a story every step of the way down this ancient street, which used to be called the Alta Semita, the high path. And here you see it snaking through by all kinds of landmarks in Italo Gismondi's 1930s model of what Rome looked like in the time of Constantine. So this is Imperial Rome, and the Alta Semita, which was probably an Etruscan road, taking you from the center of Rome to the land of the Etruscans in Tuscany to the north. And it was a long, straight road going along the crest of the Quirinale hill, and still is today. and started off with this landmark, two gigantic statues of Castor and Pollux, the divine twins, who'd once watered their horses down in the Roman Forum, one of the times that gods really came down to Rome, and showing that Rome had a divine history. And in the Renaissance, everybody thought these must be made by the greatest sculptors of antiquity, Phidias, who did the Parthenon, and Praxiteles, about whom they read a lot. And so each of these had to be that. And we now think that they're sort of standard issue Roman statues for outdoors, so they're not the greatest things in the world. But in the Renaissance, people really loved them. And the Alta Semita was decorated near the Roman, or the center of the Roman, the forum side of the Alta Semita as it went out to the north. It went by the largest of the temples in Rome, aside from the temple of Capitoline Jupiter. It was to Isis and Serapis, and that was put up in the 3rd century AD by the Emperor Aurelian, and you can see it had turned into a total ruin by the time anybody was around to draw it on paper that survived till today. And it became incorporated into the palazzo of the powerful Colonna family. So that's what you're seeing here. Here it is in an early 16th century guidebook. And so this was one of the big sites that you went to see. Then, as Rome became a capital city, it all got engulfed by the Pontifical Gregorian University. And so now what we call the Greg is sitting on a lot of it, and the rest of the ruins are in the private garden of the Colonna family. And the only way to see this monumental pile of bricks is to go to the pontifical stables in the Quirinale and take the fire escape after you've seen whatever the exhibition of the moment is, and then you can stand on the fire escape and peek down, or if you're friends with the Colonnas, you can get into their palazzo, but you're seeing just bits and pieces of what used to be a giant monument. Then the high path skirts the Baths of Diocletian, put in the 290s AD, and the biggest, fanciest bath you've ever seen in Rome, still very much with us. And finally, you reach the Porta Nomentana, which takes you out to a place called Nomentum. That gate still exists here, but as you'll see, it's been replaced by a Michelangelo gate, and that's why this one's not in great repair. And out this bridge is where Nero, in the year 68, ran away because he realized that everybody in Rome hated him, and he committed suicide so that more terrible things wouldn't happen to him. So it's a storied street, and that's why Pope Pius IV, whose name is Giovanni Angelo Medici, it's not dei Medici, it's just plain old Medici. He's not one of those Medicis. He's a guy who has the same name. And those Medicis were kind enough, because he was Pope, to semi-claim them so they could have even another Medici Pope in history. And you can see he was only Pope for 5 years, so he had to work really hard. His other misfortune is that he's elected in 1559, and that means he doesn't have a chance of living to see a jubilee. He's got to do things for pilgrims without the excuse of saying, what are we going to do for the jubilee? 1550's over. 1600 is so far in advance, he knows he's not going to last that long. Nonetheless, he bravely soldiered on and did nice things. And so here's his coat of arms, where you have the Medici. You can see fleur-de-lis, because Catherine de Medicis had married into the French royal family, and so they wanted to. Not only do we have the 3 balls that denote a pawnbroker, we got 6 of them, and one of them's got a French fleur-de-lis on it because we have a French princess, and so we'll take this guy from Milan and claim him as one of our own. And so everybody's happy. You can see this is solid gold, so he's got access to a certain amount of money from the pontifical funds. He's best known for the person who issues the final decrees of the Reforming Council of Trent in 1563. And here you see the Council of Trent. in a fresco that's painted by Cardinal Altemps, who's one of the people who's most significant in the end of it. And Pius is sitting nicely under a canopy. And here are the final decrees of the Council of Trent with a very nice Jesuit sign. So the J's were very much in there. He built himself a nice garden house that's now in the Vatican Gardens, and it's the seat of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences. And he also decided, because Rome is becoming more and more of a pilgrimage site, to cash in on a recent practice that was installed officially in 1553 by Saint Philip Neri, who was a Roman who originally wanted to go on mission and then realized he could make just as much progress with mission if he ministered to the poor people of Rome, and he started doing that. And he did something called the Pilgrimage of the Seven Churches. So he picked 7 of the oldest churches in Rome, and if you went to all of them in a day, which takes, according to Google Maps, about 3 hours and 40 minutes on foot if you're really going, you can do it, and you got all kinds of indulgences. But he sweetened the whole enterprise by having songs to sing. So you sang songs, and there were picnics at every stop. And so this thing lasted as long as it needed to. People still do it all the time. At a certain point, because they wanted to attract a wealthier class of pilgrims, it was all right if you did it on horseback, or even better, with the latest in transportation, the carriage. And so one of the things that you see Pius doing with the Strada Pia and some of his other projects is facilitating carriage access to all of these pilgrimage sites, because that brings you important people who are influential, who can say, I had such a great time doing the pilgrimage of the 7 churches. Why don't you come to Rome and try? And then drum up a tourist business, and you can see them all trotting dutifully around, including over this bridge on the right-hand side, which after 1598 was called the Broken Bridge and remains broken today. So this is a pamphlet before that. So what did he do? First of all, he decided that the Church of St. John Lateran looked way too medieval, and so he put those 2 Sleeping Beauty castle towers to make it an attraction. This is actually the side entrance to the Lateran, but that's the side that really faces Rome, number 1. Number 2, by the time that Borromini began to restore the Lateran, its nave in the 1640s, it was 3 meters off vertical. The walls were listing, and so I think they were scared to go in the nave of the Lateran in case it collapsed, which it did 3 times in the 14th century, and there was the plague. And so what Pius did is make that little Sleeping Beauty feature, which is still with us today. 1 bell tower is great, 2 bell towers are better. And this way, it's a landmark, so when you're a pilgrim and you're getting hot and sweaty, you can see Sleeping Beauty's castle in the distance. Walt Disney clearly borrowed this idea for his own Sleeping Beauty castle. And there you can see the Lateran, again, with these 2 towers prominent. So they really are acting as a signpost to pilgrims. Look at the dome of St. Peter's down here that's not even finished yet. And so they're hoping it'll really get finished. There's Santa Maria Maggiore. It's got 1 bell tower. Everybody else has 1 bell tower. So having 2 for the Lateran, which is the mother church of Christendom, and keeps trying to remind St. Peter's that they're number 1. St. Peter's was the 2nd church consecrated in Rome. Still an ongoing battle. And so this is the Rome that Pius is dealing with. And what he decided to do is make a second important pilgrim street besides the Via Flaminia, today's Via del Corso, which goes from the Porta del Popolo right down to the center of Rome. And so he has a second thoroughfare going north to break up the tourist traffic and make sure that there are not too many sacred traffic jams. And so his whole itinerary, instead of starting with the horse tamers, he starts at his favorite church in Rome, San Silvestro al Quirinale, which he did a lot of decoration in, and where he installed his nephew, Charles Borromeo, who's a Milanese nobleman. And you can see he lived from 1538 to 1584, and so he's right in his prime as a churchman when he's invited down to Rome by his uncle and then goes back to Milan and does all kinds of things and becomes extremely important in church history. And so this is the Alta Semita in the hands of Pius IV, starting with San Silvestro down here on the bottom, and then up at the top, he decides, need a new gate, with his name on it preferably, instead of that old Roman gate. And so the person he engages to make this gate is Michelangelo, who did a lot of work for those other Medici, and so he, again, adopts a Medici persona and says, Michelangelo, I've got some things for you to do. Can you make us a new city gate for the new Rome, for the new pilgrimage, in the new style? And Michelangelo's drawing for the new gate, which is called Porta Pia, after Pius. So instead of Porta Nomentana, it becomes Pius Street, Pius Gate. And this is what we ended up with, except for the very top, which was struck by lightning in the 1840s and replaced by Pope Pius IX. Everything else that you see, which is weird, and it gets weirder the more you look at it. This is Michelangelo in his 80s doing all kinds of wild and crazy things because he's Michelangelo and he can. And in the 1550s, we've been through the whole business of the early Renaissance, the high Renaissance, and so this is a period of real experimentation. And then suddenly in the 1570s, 1580s, and 1590s, things will clamp down and become terribly neoclassical. But here you've got just wild and crazy motifs. And there's no gate that looks like this in the rest of Rome. There's really no gate that looks like this anywhere else on the planet. And so it's a real signpost that you're someplace special. Because the city walls still really acted as city walls. They're defensive walls. The fancy gates on the inside, not on the outside, because otherwise the danger is that it would be pulverized by artillery, as in fact this gate was in 1870. The other side of it was completely pulverized by the Bersaglieri in the Battle of Porta Pia. But Michelangelo's gate, aside from that lightning strike, has remained intact and entertains students of architecture for all of its wild and crazy designs. It has ever since. Right in the middle, where you see a whole group of churches, he decided to put a water source, because this whole area was well watered in Roman antiquity, and then the barbarians cut the aqueducts in the 5th century, and ever since, all you had were wells. And so one of the things he thought would really make this street valuable is to get a whole new neighborhood, and the way to get a whole new neighborhood is to put water in the neighborhood, and that means to repair an ancient Roman aqueduct and give it an outlet. And so he started making a fountain, of which the only thing that survives is this little parapet here. Everything else was done in the 1580s by Pope Sixtus V, but right along here in the detailed slide you can see it says Pius IV Pontifex Maximus. So it was going to be the Fontana Pia on the Strada Pia pointing at the Porta Pia, brought to you by Pio IV. And then instead, Sixtus V came along and finished it and put in these wonderful, placidly spitting lions who were taken from the Lateran and given a whole new task of spitting water at this fountain. And then it was finally decided that the original lions were too precious to be out in a major traffic node, and so they've been moved to the Vatican Museum. So these are the original lions from the Lateran that spent time at the fountain that wasn't Pia but ended up being Felice because of Felice Peretti, who was Pope Sixtus V. He also had Michelangelo work on the roadside attraction that you had as you went down the former Alta Semita, now Strada Pia, and the fountain is right about here. These are the great baths that Diocletian built right before the whole generation of Constantine and the changeover from classical Rome to Christian Rome. And what Michelangelo did is put a church inside here and a Carthusian monastery, so that you have monks, not friars who live in the city, but monks living in seclusion. And they lived in a series of apartments that are actually the prototype for modern condo complexes. There's a famous Carthusian monastery outside Florence, and then this one, and first time I saw the one in Florence, I thought, wow, they put up a condo complex. Looks sort of old. Well, no, it's an old Carthusian monastery that's inspired every condo complex you could ever think of. And there's some fabulous condos here, except each of them was big enough for a young family, but a single, very wealthy Carthusian was there with his help. And they also raised a particular breed of very large, very furry cats. And so this is what Michelangelo had to work with. It's not a great slide. And this is an equally not very great slide of what he might have done. We now think he did more than this, and there was more left from antiquity than this drawing lets on, because people have really combed over the actual space. And it turns out that a surprising amount of the cornice up there is ancient rather than Luigi Vanvitelli in the 18th century and Michelangelo in the 16th. The vault was put in by Michelangelo. And so the one thing we know that Michelangelo definitely put his hands on here was that vault where he's vaulting over an ancient Roman bath where the vault is precarious. And here's the inside of the monastery as it's been laid out, where you've got these disembodied heads of very large animals popping out of the bushes. And this is some crazy Carthusian in the 18th century who's just having a lot of fun. But the elegance of the space is indisputable. It's just been restored. And then this small cloister, you can see, pokes right into the old outdoor swimming pool of Diocletian's baths and completely wrecks the design, which is the idea. You've got a monastery in the middle of this pagan splash pool, which has recently, again, been totally restored, and it's got fancy light fixtures that mimic the play of water at night, and so they have cocktail parties here at night that are just spectacular. And if you go to Rome, going to the baths of Diocletian by night is an experience not to be missed. I got to go to the inauguration because I was moonlighting, writing for Architectural Lighting magazine, which means you get cocktails as long as you watch the light fixtures being put in use. And so I got to see the Sistine Chapel's new light fixtures, eat dinner in the Vatican museums, and all I had to do was watch a lecture demonstration, which was good. So I knew that the new Sistine Chapel is lit on two things, normal and conclave. So these arms come out with special LED lights so the cardinals will see their ballots and vote correctly. And here what they did is make the swimming pool have a light play that suggests splashing waters as you're splashing in cocktails without end. And here's the front of the basilica as it exists today. And so what you've got is an ancient Roman ruin turned by Pius IV and Michelangelo into a functioning, fabulous church with really amazing spaces. And then this space to the left of it, in 1764, became an oil storage facility in case there's a food shortage in Rome. And the whole basement is filled with jars that are about as tall as I am, that were once filled with oil. And it's now part of the architecture faculty of the University of Rome because it's such a wild and crazy space. And a movie was made of Strada Pia, so inspirational is its history. But the really inspiring thing are the two churches that we're about to look at. They weren't the only churches. Once this fountain got going in 1587, suddenly there's an incentive to build a neighborhood here. And the first people who got there were all the new religious orders that followed on the Council of Trent, and some of the old religious orders wanting to stake some kind of a claim. So you've got a church put up by Teresa of Avila's Discalced Carmelites. There's another church that is the Cistercians, which are an old order, but they want to have their place in Rome reasserted. A lot of nuns get property up here. So the Strada Pia is the place to build a new showcase for everybody in Rome. And so that tower that we see in this foggy slide becomes San Bernardo alle Terme, where a number of pious noble women of Rome build this for the Cistercian order. And then on the other side, there's a matching tower. This is one of the corner towers of the ancient baths. The other one's a garage. And so Rome, you just never know. Sometimes they take care of the ruins. Sometimes they really don't. And then to celebrate the confluence of basically four roads, there was a fountain complex that Pope Gregory XIII put up in the 1570s called the Four Fountains. And the theme of the Four Fountains is Tuscany and Rome are good friends. So you have the River Arno, the River of Florence, and the River Tiber. And then for the countryside, you have Diana. And for the city, you have Juno, the wife of Jupiter. And so it's all wonderful symbolism. And at that corner, oh, there it is. And you've also got down the street a summer palace for the popes going up since Gregory XIII. So Gregory is 1572 to 1585. He's the person who brought in the new Gregorian calendar. And he's interested in having a place that's nice and breezy, where the mosquitoes don't fly as well as they do in the area around the Vatican, which is lower. There you can see the horse tamers, and way, way, way in the distance you can see Porta Pia. And so right there on this portentous, important street is this new palace, which is now the presidential palace of the president of Italy, Sergio Mattarella. And halfway along is where you've got the big fountain, and that's where you get also a little distance away, these four fountains. So this is thirsty pilgrims having drinking fountains as they're making their way to the center of Rome. And by the time you get here, you look out and there's a fabulous view, and you know you've arrived, and you can see St. Peter's, and you can heave a great breath of relief. And there's another drinking fountain there. So this is just liberally salted with drinking fountains for the public, and there's the view that you get when you finally get to the horse tamers. So the two people who end up being the big draws on this street are Gian Lorenzo Bernini. It says 1598. He was born on December 7th of 1598. So he's really practically the same age as Borromini, who's born in 1599. This is Bernini when he's about 19, making faces because he's doing a soul who's burning in hell. And so he's in the mirror. And so this is the real Bernini. He's a man of a full range of emotions and sculptural talent, second to only Michelangelo, if he's even... This is a really early work. This is St. Lawrence frying on the grill, and this one, Bernini stuck his leg in a barbecue to see what it felt like. St. Lawrence famously, when he was on the grill, said, "I think I'm done on this side, you can turn me over," showing the true courage of a martyr. And there are 3 churches in Rome that claim to have fat that dripped from that grill, which for the classicists among you has a partitive ablative ex pinguitudine. Fascinating grammar. And so this is Gian Lorenzo Bernini with his leg in a barbecue. This is Gian Lorenzo Bernini grimacing in a mirror. This is Gian Lorenzo Bernini being David about to sling his slingshot at Goliath, biting his lip with concentration. That this is a man of tremendous physical and creative energy. Here he is, calmer, drawing himself. He has a certain fascination with himself. He was a person of many facets. He did theater, he sculpted, clearly he painted, he drew, and he was an architect. So he's totally versatile. And he was really charming. Borromini, there are only 2 images we know of him. This one may be of him. It's a painting of somebody who's the right age for the young Borromini, and people, this is a painting that has no known painter, no known subject, but people think it may be a painting of Borromini, who's famous enough early on that he could warrant it, wearing black as Borromini famously did in the Spanish style. This is certainly Borromini, his one and only book, which is a little pamphlet about one of his projects. And you can see he looks worried. He killed himself finally because he was depressed. But you see, he's got architect's tools, and he was never anything but an architect. So this is a person who's absolutely fixated on architecture. Whereas, and not terribly sociable. People who knew him well loved him. He died with 1,000 books in his library. Bernini had only 400. Caravaggio, the great painter, had 15. Lucretia Borgia had 15. And so Borromini is incredibly learned and spends a lot of money on books. Bernini is awfully learned as well. But they're 2 very different temperaments. And this is the other painting, and I'm getting this low resolution thing. This is a little caricature that belonged to my dear friend Enzo Crea, and I think probably now belongs to his son Alessio. And it's a caricature of Borromini brooding, and then you can see him in his fancy Spanish outfit gesticulating wildly. And he's got this big cross that he got on this big gold chain, and that was a medal that he got from Spain, and so he wore it. If you got a gold chain and you were an artist or architect, you made sure everybody knew you had a chain. Caravaggio's master, the Cavaliere d'Arpino, used to be called Giuseppe Cesare, Joe Caesar, and then he got his chain and he was called the Knight of Arpino. And he went to bed with his chain. He wanted everybody to know he had his chain. And Borromini's similarly devoted to his chain. They met at St. Peter's, where they were both doing sculptural works. And they parted ways at St. Peter's when Borromini found out that Bernini was earning 20 times what he was. And they really parted. And Borromini's uncle Carlo Maderno is the person who completed the facade of St. Peter's. So St. Peter's was finished in the 1620s. The final touches the interior are where Bernini and Borromini were working with each other, and above all on the baldacchino that covers the tomb of St. Peter, and that's where they came to grief. This is what Pope Urban VIII Barberini melted down the porch of the Pantheon, which was coated in bronze, to create. And there's a raging debate between Bernini people and Borromini people about who designed this, because those curves at the top, so the best drawing of it is by Borromini, And those amazing curves that you see at the top of it that go like this appear in nothing else in Bernini's work. Bernini really believes in pure geometric figures, semicircles, squares, ovals, nothing too fancy. Borromini, as you're going to see, is pushing the envelope of what form can be. And so Paolo Portoghese, the great architect and architectural scholar of the 20th and 21st century, thinks Borromini designed this, and that's why he got mad and took his toys and went off. And the place he went in 1633 was this little site at the Four Fountains. The church of this site can fit under one of the piers of St. Peter's. It's so teeny tiny. And it was a church for an order called the Discalced Trinitarians, which is sometimes translated as barefoot, but discalced doesn't mean barefoot. Same thing with St. Teresa of Avila's discalced Carmelites means Birkenstocks and socks, which is not nerd clothing. Here you see Joseph in a 5th century. This is the 430s in Santa Maria Maggiore, and this is one of my favorite mosaics in Rome. This is Joseph finding out that Mary's already got a child by the Holy Spirit. And this artist is so great at portraying character. Cut Joseph. He's not sure. And he's wearing socks and sandals, and that way you can recognize him in all the panels of this. The 3 kings are men in tights with pearls. Herod's wearing socks and sandals, and so emperors wore socks and sandals. Augustus wore socks and sandals. It's not the way that we say socks and sandals are the sign of a complete geek. It was a thing you could do, and it was, with religious orders, a way that you could say you weren't wearing shoes, you were wearing sandals, but not dying of pneumonia. And so St. Teresa says specifically, wear socks, don't kill yourself. And in the same way, the discalced Trinitarians wear socks with their Birkenstocks when it's cold. They were an order conceived to liberate captives. And so they're working all around the Mediterranean, and especially with ransoming people who have been taken prisoner by Islamic pirates. And so here you see Jesus as a discalced Trinitarian. I think he's just wearing sandals, not wearing socks, but you can see captives being set free. So you've got a blonde person and an African person and a Mediterranean person. So it's every kind of person that they can imagine. And what they're saying is everybody, the people who are most plentiful in Italy have dark hair and dark eyes, but they know they're blonde people and they know that they're black people. And all of them equally, if they're captive, are freed by the Trinitarians. And this is their 14th century house, which is inside a Roman aqueduct, and they don't have very much room. And so they decided to have a new church. And they said to Borromini, don't spend too much money, you've got a small budget, but try to make it beautiful. And so he came up with a floor plan like this, where you've got the church, you've got a courtyard, and then a few cells for the brothers. And then in the back, you've got a little garden. So it's just a teeny tiny little site. And what he does is pack all the ingenuity into that tiny space that he can possibly do. So here's a cutaway view of it. And when you walk in, you see it's mostly white. It used to be pink. And then they realized Borromini wanted the space to be white. So it looks as if it's Carrara marble. Even if it's not Carrara marble, you can always pretend for a minute that it's Carrara marble. And then you've got a little bit of gold, and you've got these almost blank columns which force your eye up to this extraordinary vault. It's oval. Kepler has just suggested that the orbits of the planets are oval. And so what you're seeing here is up-to-date cosmology put into new architecture. So St. Peter's is designed back when everybody thinks that the world system has the Earth at the center and the orbits are all round. This is the new science enshrined in architecture and an incredibly complex and small space. So there you see it. And what's striking about it is something that's also striking about the architecture of Carlo Maderno, Borromini's uncle. They can get light into a space like nobody else. And you stand in their churches and they're just bathed in light, and San Carlo. And the Carlo is Charles Borromeo. So Charles Borromeo, they know perfectly well, is right down the street with his legacy in San Silvestro, Quirinale. And so this is taking a local boy on a neighborhood street and enshrining him. He's now been canonized, and this is one of his early churches. And then you can see, because they're the Trinitarians, there are lots of threes. And Borromini's design, whatever it's doing, is talking a lot about the Trinity. And so you've got the Trinitarian vision up there in the cupola, so the Holy Spirit's coming down as a Trinity. And so here we are going up from the columns to the next level with this oval dome, and then finally to the cupola where the Holy Spirit's inside a triangle. So it's 3, 3, 3, 3. And that's really most of what Borromini wants you to get out of it. He wants you to think of light as an image of God and God's illumination. And he wants you to think of the Trinity. If you come away with that, then you've gotten something out of this church. And we have viewer records where viewers say what was so extraordinary is the light that came in. People have tried for years and years and years to figure out what's going on with that floor plan. And especially in the 60s and 70s, everybody was doing geometries. And I gave a talk, I guess now it's year before last, along with Paolo Portoghese, this architect and scholar I talked about. And he had 27 different attempts by people to draw Borromini's floor plan, none of which worked. They all fudged. And the reason they fudged, I think my dad figured out. My dad's a scientist. I just once said to him, "What's going on with Borromini?" And he said, "It's a compass-drawn curve with a moving center for the compass." And so instead of just bam, it's kinetic. And this is the century where they're inventing calculus, which is a mathematics of motion. And so at that point, I realized the reason people weren't getting this is they're trying to do two-dimensional geometry without vectors. And if you want to understand what that floor plan is, not only do you have to have compass with moving center, but if you look at those pieces, those arches aren't flat, they're twisting. They're going into 3 dimensions. And so what you've got here is higher mathematics. He's doing with architecture what Frank Gehry's doing in our time, where you're taking higher mathematics, applying it to architecture, and figuring out what happens. And what happens in Borromini's mind, you're really producing a more accurate, more marvelous image of the universe as he understands it, and he's understanding God in terms of higher mathematics. Part of the peculiar pattern in the dome is taken from an early Christian building, the mausoleum of Saint Costanza. Constantia is the daughter of Constantine, which is itself a pretty phantasmagoric space. And this is from about 360. And one of the mosaics is precisely this pattern. So Borromini's looking at this, which is also on the Via Nomentana, the extension of the Alta Semita. So you go out the gate, and eventually you run into this church. And so far we've seen all sorts of references to different parts of the Strada Pia. It's all the package deal. And then here you can see how you've got these cherubs that have 3s. There are all kinds of really clever things going on here. But what really fascinates me right now are those curves and the fact that the curves are doing these things that my dad could understand mathematically. I can grasp the mathematics of higher mathematics, but I'm dyslexic and I can't do arithmetic to save my life. So here's Dad when he was quite a bit younger. And here you've got compass-drawn curves with moving centers. I think that's Galileo's notes over there, and a nautilus shell. And here you've got Giordano Bruno, who was burned at the stake in 1600 for the Jubilee of 1600. And Bruno was also getting towards the infinitesimal calculus. And one of the people that I'm most interested in, that I will not talk about here because I won't stop, was a Jesuit, Father Athanasius Kircher, who I think must have been in Borromini's library. We don't know what the books were. All we know is there were 1,000 of them. But Kircher is one of the people who really writes about cosmology and is much closer to even, he entertains or he talks about and he thinks about and he reads heretical books like Bruno, even though Bruno's on the index, but he's one of the Jesuits who can read anything he wants and does. And so I think there are all kinds of things about Borromini and the infinitesimal calculus that if I ever have time to sit down and really cram the math into my head, will come out to be something. So this is where I am with Borromini right now. It's an image of the new universe revealed by science, as it will be called, but is now called natural philosophy. And then he's just got architect tricks. How do you make a teeny tiny courtyard look bigger than it is? Well, you make the top columns so much smaller than the bottom columns on the bottom story that it looks as if they're way up in space, even though what's really happening is you've got normal-sized columns and then teeny tiny columns. And here's a regular person by the parapet. And it gives you some of the elegance of a really big courtyard, like this one in Rome in the Palazzo della Cancelleria, even though this is like a tiny corner of the Palazzo della Cancelleria. And you can see he's doing all kinds of curves in and out. And then there are these crazy spiral staircases. This is some of the brothers' cells. And he's borrowing a motif from Raphael, where what you do is tie two columns together and make a kind of two-column unit. And that's what he's doing here. And by glomming those together and not articulating them, they seem a little bit bigger because you don't have as much decoration to measure with your mind's eye. And then there are all kinds of wonderful symbols. So this is clearly about God as light and the Trinity. What exactly it means is anybody's guess, because Borromini didn't give us any written clue. And then you go down this amazing spiral staircase, and there's a crypt where all the brothers are buried. And you used to only be able to, there's this horrible sacristan, and if you were female, his tongue would hang out from his two teeth, and he'd try to give you a postcard and feel you, and so you had to be really brave. And finally, so this is 1630s. 1667, the brothers had enough money to pay for a facade, and so Borromini produced this. An undulating facade. This is on a narrow street, and so the way that he's making you pay attention is by having it go into 3 dimensions. And you've got Charles Borromeo in glory in the middle with seraphim framing him, and then other important members of the community. And then these crazy architectural details. Borromini always does his own. He doesn't copy anything that the ancients did. He makes his own. And then he died while this was happening. He committed suicide in a moment of depression. And it's excruciating. We have the police report because they had to decide whether he'd committed suicide and whether he could be buried in consecrated ground. And at one point they said, "Did you despair?" He'd run himself. He fell on his own sword, and he said, "As I said, I wanted to do some harm to myself, that is, to skewer myself with the sword as I've described to you." But he was, in fact, ultimately buried in the Church of St. John of the Florentines with his uncle, Carlo Maderno. And so they decided, despite all of this, at the very end, it was all right. And so this cupola we see in the front was done by Bernardo, his nephew, rather than Borromini himself. And that kind of undulating facade you really don't see anywhere except in Torino with the other wild and crazy mathematician architect of the 17th century, Guarino Guarini, with Palazzo Carignano, which is way bigger than San Carlino, and it's got a piazza in front of it, and the original Grom ice cream shop. So you can go there and eat incredibly good ice cream and look at this amazing facade. And what more can you want out of life? It's just one of those sublime experiences. So Borromini had influence, but he also scared people to death. And so when Alexander VII became Pope in 1655, he was a good friend of the Society of Jesus, and he knew that they really need, there's a casual portrait of him, again, a close friend. I can't talk about him because I'll be here all night. But this was the Jesuit novice house, San Vitale, 8th century, with a nice 12th century portico that you're seeing there. It was nowhere big enough for all the Jesuits who were wanting to become Jesuits in the 17th century. The order's just taking off like wildfire. And so Alexander VII decides right across from his expansion of that pontifical palace on the Strada Pia that Gregory XIII had begun, gave the Jays a great big property and talked to his good friend Bernini, with whom he used to take frequent walks in the Vatican gardens, and they'd sketch together. And there's one manuscript in the Vatican that's both of them. And so with Elizabeth Keevan, who's the great scholar of Bernini, we've looked at it to try to figure out who drew what line, and we can't tell. It was really fun trying to figure it out. Because I'm really familiar with Fabio Chigi, Alexander VII. And so, oh, Fabio did that, so look, he's got that pencil. And she'd say, yeah, but Bernini, that looks like his hand. And we just don't, they're so close that they're really practically one person. So who else is going to build this house for the Jesuits but Bernini? And this is the plan he comes up with circa 1657. And here you've got an engraving of it. And not only does he know there's an oval church down the street by Borromini, by this time he'd done an oval chapel for the College of the Propagation of the Faith, which Borromini had torn out and built his own square chapel. And so he really wants to build an oval chapel, and he wants to build an oval chapel that's going to do exactly what it seems to have done to you, to say, look at this great thing. Forget Borromini. So it was the third Jesuit church in Rome. First one was the Church of Jesus, the Gesù, which used to be really austere and is not anymore, but that's its 18th century version. So here you see it at the 100th anniversary of the order in 1640, when it's still austere and it's hung with drapes. So it's basilica with a dome and a barrel vault. Second church, the Church of St. Ignatius, which was started in 1622, still going in the 1670s. And then you can see that dome. The dome's fake. They never got the budget to make the dome. So it's a painting, and when you walk in, you could swear it's a real dome. And as you get closer and closer, it gets stranger and stranger looking. The shell of the dome is there outside. They just never built the whole cupola. And this is Bernini's plan. So Borromini's oval has its narrow side to the street, so Bernini does it the other way. And he has not an undulating facade in the way that he's still got a protruding facade, but it's semicircles. It's all nice, standard two-dimensional geometric shapes. So it's safe. Right across the way is the side entrance to the Quirinale Palace, which today is staffed by the corazzieri, the presidential guard, who have to be at least 6'4", and they wear these horse tails and these metal breastplates, and they are very fine figures of men, and when they salute you, it just makes you want to faint. And so I always, and look, we can go see if they're corazzieri, and there's always a corazziere there with his cape and his horsehair plume cascading down his back. And this is what happens when you go in. So you've got a gold dome, and you've got pink marble on the walls. So I go back to that debate I talked about. My friend Elaine said, we were 23, and Elaine and I were feeling irreverent. She said, looks like somebody threw up a strawberry milkshake on those walls. So I said this to Jim McGregor, and Jim took off, and he's, there are those who've said this looks like a strawberry milkshake. And then he goes into the whole literary history of the flesh being rosy colored and white, and talking about sinews and muscles and all of this, and martyrdom. And he starts saying, this is a Colosseum. And then he quotes St. Paul on the virtuous race, I've run the race, and how you have a cloud of witnesses. And so he said, this is a Colosseum. This is Jesuits going to mission where they don't know if they're going to become court astronomer in Beijing or be boiled alive. And what it's doing is steeling you to face anything. And so what you've got is this lower layer of the church that's the layer of the flesh. And the end of that may well be martyrdom, as it was for St. Andrew. But then you go beyond that. If you're a martyr, you see the beatific vision at the moment of death. Heaven opens to you. And what you see is Andrew rising up into golden heaven. And so Jim McGregor said that, and we all, and say, so you see, this is no strawberry milkshake. And we all just wanted to cry because we knew we were not going to win Golden Howard Rourke, and it was one of the most beautiful pieces of rhetoric I've ever heard. Plus, I think it's true. So here's St. Andrew, bathed in gold from heaven, on the cross at the moment where he's dying, but as he dies, heaven's opening to him, and he's got his own special dome that's not for us. The priest can see it, but the congregation can't. And of course, they're thinking of the Via Crucis at the Colosseum. So there's Francis doing his Via Crucis, but the Colosseum, to people in the 17th century, was a site of martyrdom. We now know that it wasn't quite the Christian charnel house that it was thought to be in the 17th century, but for Bernini's purposes, this is what he thinks. The Colosseum is where martyrs die in the theater, where you have witnesses who are humans, and then you've got the saints above witnessing your act of martyrdom, that you're never alone. And so there's Andrew's special heaven spilling down cherubs to take him up. And then you've got this pure white, blank Andrew. So this is Andrew in the glorified body, where he's just not human anymore. He's a neutral color. And he's being taken up into this golden heaven. And all around the golden heaven are the saints watching. So there he is. And this, I think, is actually sort of shorthand for the glorified body in Baroque sculpture, because usually you're doing it with Carrara marble, which is the easiest marble to sculpt, and it takes fantastic shapes, and it's white color. They're also fantastic, as we're going to see, colored marbles, but it's incredibly hard to carve them. They're so much harder that you can't make a Bernini sculpture with a colored marble. And you can see the same Colosseum motif with the crowds of saints watching. And so even St. Peter's, we always call it square, but it's an oval. So St. Peter's oval is the same thing. It's a Colosseum with these saints watching you to see how are you going to behave when you come to the test. And so here you can see that colored marble is something that they really love. This is Alexander VII's tomb, where he's not plaster. That St. Andrew's plaster, so it's cheap. Here, Alexander VII, again, is in the glorified body. His kidney stones aren't killing him anymore. So he's not himself. He's not a human being anymore. And then down below, in colored marble, you've got this huge curtain that's the same marble as the strawberry milkshake of Sant'Andrea. And then you can see there's this bronze skeleton coming out of it. So it's a giant curtain of the flesh. And it's the flesh pretty literally sculpted in marble as meat. And it's a skeleton flying free of being meat. And what it's saying is that we, as human beings, with our souls released, get out of the flesh, and we get finally refined into pure gold. So there's the skeleton in this wonderful black bronze, and then you can see this black marble, which is really rare, but it's so hard to carve. It practically blunts your chisel on impact. And so they'll try to carve it. Bernini's pretty good, but he'll never do anything but drapery with it because it's just so hard. And then you can see that here you've got Truth stepping on Britain, which is remaining Anglican. And just a little stab at the English monarchy. And then you can see time's flying. And here you've even got the sun cooperating with Bernini's whole scheme. And so Sant'Andrea al Quirinale, I think, is telling you something fascinating as well, spiritually. And the color of that dome comes from this passage from the book of Ezekiel, where the Hebrew word can mean either electrum, which is an alle of gold and silver, or amber. It's the same word. We don't know really which it is. And so usually you hedge your bets when you're doing a painting, as Raphael's doing here with his vision of Ezekiel. And that's why this is this color. This is the color of heaven. It's an alloy of gold and silver. And that's your choice. Now we can vote. And thank you. Now, should we have a vote?
Do you want to vote?
Yeah, let's vote.
Okay. Well, who's going to stand who's going to stand with me for Borromini? Sant'Andrea al Quirinale. How many for San Carlo? What's the fountain? Well, you did it. The lecture was successful.
No, it's nice that there's a mix.
Any questions, comments?
They're both given a lot of leeway because they have one sympathetic person who's associated with the orders. I think with Sant'Andrea, it's probably, or it's not Fabio, it's Sforza Pallavicini, his biographer, who's a Jesuit. And Sforza Pallavicini's watching it the whole time. One of the Chigi cardinals is nominally involved, but I think Pallavicini is the intellect and also just the diplomat who's making it happen. Plus you have somebody who's got the complete trust of the Pope. And the Pope's favorite house is right across the street, and so you could just see Fabio coming over and seeing how things are going. We have preserved his outfit that he used to wear for these garden walks with Bernini. He says in his diary, we stripped. And so stripped means that you've got hose and those puffy pants and a vest and all in white satin and your little zuccotto. And so he'd show up around the Vatican garden, and then they'd have this manuscript between the two of them. And then obviously they also were discussing papers. There are a lot of papers in Chigi's collection in the Vatican Library, and the Chigi P7 series of manuscripts has some of these projects. And so that's really well documented. And what we've got is one of the members of the congregation for the Discalced Trinitarians who's following it just step by step, and they're arguing all the time. So every bit of it. In Borromini, they'll keep saying we have to be austere, we've got to be austere. And he says, I'm keeping the budget as low as possible. And then they're happy because people go into the church and say it's really beautiful, and so then they feel more relieved. But I think that gap between the interior and the exterior says something, that they're trying to find out how well this is selling to the public. Then this whole Strada Pia thing I found fascinating, because when I was going to do it, it was first going to be just Bernini and Borromini, and then I thought, well, let's think about the Strada Pia. And then I got so into that because it really does have all of these interesting things. And now it's great in PowerPoint because they're not cars zipping up and down. And when we had our debate, we had to debate in front of the churches. And so my friends and I are preparing this heartfelt defense of Borromini's facade. And there's a stoplight at the Four Fountains. This car comes up, and this dog sticks its head out of the back seat of the car and goes, whoop, 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 whoop. And so we're trying to talk about the facade, and the dog's barking. And the Bernini team said, the dog says it's a real bow wow of a facade. And so we're completely deflated. And that was the end of it.
Why do you think they chose to orient the ovals in the directions?
I think Bernini did it because Borromini did it the other way. And I think Borromini did it that way for space because he had so little space that he could pack the courtyard and the church into that one little chunk. And the other one, I think it's just pure spite at what happened because of the vanished chapel of the Three Kings. And of course, what Borromini put in instead of the Bernini chapel is sheer genius. It's, I'm personally not devastated, but he was.
You talked about how the St. Ignatius Chapel didn't have enough money to finish their dome, but when I look at like the Sant'Andrea Quirinale, like a dome, like it's very like covered in gold and very elaborate. Was this built in a kind of like great Jesuit, like a surge in Jesuit power in Rome?
Yeah, there really is. And if you see the size of the novitiate house behind the church, I didn't show, there are not any really good photographs, but it's huge. What I do is take students to the park next door, and then you can see it just goes back, and you can see where, because San Vitale's right down the hill from it, and so you've got this little old 8th century, and they redid it in 1595, so the interior's all redone, but it's just tiny. And then this thing's just mega galactic. And then they've got another church that I didn't talk about for the German-Hungarian Jesuits called Santo Stefano Rotondo that has hideous tortures inflicted on martyrs in gruesome labeled detail. And so you walk in, it's this fantastic space, but I just can't bear to look at what's happening to these people on the side. And that again is to prepare them for what they may experience and may not experience. And they just don't know when they're sent off.
You know, the Trinitarians were, did they take a vow of stability? Like, was that their community? Because, like, this would have been a way station for Jesuits, right? The novitiate was
Yeah.
But for the Trinitarians, was that like a lifetime commitment that they were living in that church?
I think so, because I've seen the ones that have been manning San Carlino have been there for a long time. And now, because they don't ransom prisoners of Turkish pirates anymore, but they do a lot of charity work, and they've actually got another setup near where I live in Trastevere. They took over San Crisogono also, and they're working with hospitals a lot. So I think, like the Knights of Malta, they've become a hospital or order. And there's still a lot of them around. It's one of the gratifying things about being in Rome, because both of these churches have living communities, and they're managed by real people that are still really living this life. I haven't checked the socks of the guys that are behind the desk and they're selling you postcards and see what discalced means today. But that whole thing, this came up when I was talking to Franco Mormando about Bernini's Ecstasy of St. Teresa, and she's barefooted, and he said, she explicitly says, no, wear socks and save yourself. But somehow having Bernini's Ecstasy of St. Teresa with socks wouldn't be the same thing.
Supposedly Bernini did the exercises, and that had an influence on him, or at least that's one of the things they tell you in Rome. Many things you hear in Rome aren't true, but is there a big influence that way in terms of the kind of ecstatic quality and the...
Yeah, I think so. And even that Soul in Hell, I wrote something about it and connected it with Bernini and the exercises, because one of the exercises, smell the brimstone, hear the screams. And so the damned soul really does seem to be doing, it's not just Bernini making faces, it's Bernini making faces while doing the spiritual exercises in his head. And the blessed soul is female and has a flower crown, and she just looks so boring. And he clearly is much more interested in the vision that we identify with as pain-bound human beings. I'm teaching Baroque Rome right now. My other class is on ancient Greece, and the Greeks really believe that life is pain. And I have one student who's suffering, and it's not kidney stones, but it's something like that. And he said the Greeks are really helping him out, because have somebody who says, we're unlike the gods because the gods never suffer, they never hurt, and that's all we do. And so it gives him strength as he goes through all of this.
Thank you very much.